Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to late October. It's kind of like Halloween time. I think I saw a couple of goblins and ghouls running around, little kids. It's a fun time for them. We're here to discuss something a little bit more serious, however, which is the relationship between the climate crisis and militarism. We have a great presentation lined up for you today. By the way, I'm Jeff Peckrell, and I'm part of the team that leads this forum. I'm also part of the Human Rights Working Group. And if you haven't signed up for our mailing list, we have a sheet at the door, and please do that. That's how we can notify you about great programming like what we have today. I want to mention that next week we have more on the climate crisis. We have Nan Parks from 350 Bay Area that will be here. And this one will be really about how to get involved, a lot of things that we can do as citizens of the Bay Area to help, mitigate and fight the climate crisis. And the week after that, we have Dr. Robert Oken, who is an esteemed professor from UCSF and also used to lead the psychiatry department at General Hospital here in San Francisco, talking about kind of like the relationship between homelessness and mental health issues. And this should be a very impactful and relevant topic for us. But today it will be about militarism and the climate crisis, and we'll have a special intro of our speakers coming up in just a minute. But before we do that, I just want to mention that our Q&A process that we do here is we prefer if you write your questions on little cards that should be on the table and your seats, and Robin will lead the Q&A at the conclusion of the talk. And so mostly the questions will be held to the end. And besides that, I also want to mention that we're having global conversations after church today. This is a new program that the Human Rights Working Group and especially Dolores have come up with. Give us a chance to not just listen as this is, but just to really have a discussion. So I'm looking forward to that. Bruce will be leading that today, and it is actually quite connected to this forum topic. It's also on militarism and how that's impacting our society. So please stay around for that after church today. Okay, and with that, I'd like to now do our Ohlone recognition. We are on Ohlone land here. Thank you.
We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribe. Actually, tribes, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral home of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other tribes. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dolores Perez Heilbrunn, and I have the honor of introducing our special guest today, Janet Weil. Janet Weil is a former National Code Pink staffer and has been an associate member of Veterans for Peace since 2011 and has served on the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project since its inception. Janet was also the newsletter and blog editor for Extinction Rebellion in Portland, Oregon, for 2 years before moving back to California. Her connection with our Unitarian Universalist Society, especially our Peace and Justice Committee, goes back to the heady days of the Occupy movement, when she co-founded the San Francisco 99% Coalition with members of that committee here at our church. And we worked closely on peace issues for many years. Members still remember those days. Janet, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dolores. It's great to be back at UUSF. Before I start my presentation, I want to introduce my two great colleagues who co-founded the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project of Veterans for Peace in August 2020. Steve Morse, a longtime member of Veterans for Peace, was active in the GI resistance movement that included time in Vietnam and U.S. Army prisons. He has also worked as a coordinator of the GI Rights Hotline. Steve has taught math and been a unionized metal worker. With colleagues in the labor movement, Steve has recently initiated Veterans and Labor for Sensible Priorities, which he'll talk to you about after my presentation. Vince Dijanich has Zoom hosted every meeting of the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project since summer 2020. He reads and responds to our email address, climate@veteransforpeace.org. He's presented the slideshow to numerous audiences. Vince is a Bay Area environmental activist, and he'll be talking about that work after Steve presents. So here we are with Climate Crisis, Veterans Respond. Welcome to everyone here in person and on Zoom. Thanks so much. And I look forward to our Q&A after the presentations. Next slide. The Climate Crisis and Militarism Project is a national project of Veterans for Peace, the only veterans organization calling for an end to war as an instrument of national policy. As you can see in our mission statement, we military veterans, military family members such as myself, and allies have a comprehensive and bold agenda. In a time of U.S. involvement in now 2 proxy wars, Russia-Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, we work to reveal and reduce the climate impacts of militarism and war, which are among the many costs of war. Next slide. So let's see what you all already know about the intersection of the climate crisis and militarism. So after I read each question, for those of you in person, you can just shout out the answer. For you on Zoom, drop it in the chat. Number 1, what institution, not nation, is the largest worldwide single consumer of oil and the largest emitter of greenhouse gases? Okay. Number 2, how much money did the United States spend on the global war on terror in the past 20 plus years? Okay. Number 3, true or false? The militaries of the world have to report their yearly greenhouse gas emissions to the United Nations at the yearly Conference of Parties gathering. And number 4, are climate crisis and militarism human rights issues? Okay. Well, next slide. As I expected, this is a well-informed audience. So here are some of the answers. Yes, this is finally becoming highlighted and pretty well known that the United States military, also known as the Pentagon, is the single largest institutional consumer of oil and thus emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. Number 2, the one that I think most people thought it was less than this, Cost of War has calculated that the global war on terror has cost the United States $21 trillion, or about $1 trillion per year. And that, of course, is on top of the staggering sums for the military and other actions, bases, and so on. Number 3 is false. The reporting of military emissions to the United Nations was prevented by U.S. negotiators, who, of course, were influenced by fossil fuel corporations during the Kyoto Accord negotiations in the late 90s. Probably everyone here remembers those. And the United States, in the end, did not sign on to the Kyoto Accords, but that blocking of military emissions reporting has endured. And number 4, I think the tie-in to the human rights with all of this is best expressed by Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Obviously, wars and militarism, as we're seeing now every day in devastating and catastrophic ways, both in Ukraine and Gaza, and the accelerating climate breakdown, destroy life, liberty, and security. Next slide. The climate crisis has many inputs. Here's one example of how both fuel and our tax money are burned, and how the US military racks up those greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions from military air shows for so-called entertainment and military recruiting purposes are frivolous and unnecessary. So we, in the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, have a campaign called No Mas, No Military Air Shows. And I know that San Francisco was just blasted under the roar of those jets for days earlier this month. I'm really hoping that folks in San Francisco will follow the lead of San Diego and Seattle in getting together both military veterans and people from climate and environmental groups to push back hard against these air shows. Many emissions come from land and sea vehicles and from the newish Space Force program, which uses the largest computers on Earth, which also have a lot of carbon emissions. There's also the supply chains for and maintenance of 750 U.S. military bases worldwide and hundreds of military bases here in the United States. I want to recommend strongly the book that is shown in the lower right corner of this slide, The Green Zone, The Environmental Costs of Militarism. This was written by Professor Barry, not Bernie, Sanders, and it's a great resource. Next slide. The climate crisis has been accelerating over the past 20 plus years, with an estimated 5 million excess deaths worldwide per year due to extreme weather events caused by climate change. And of course, billions of dollars are spent every year here and all over the world due to damage to infrastructure and property by those extreme weather events. Over the last generation, our government squandered $21 trillion on wars that did not achieve their stated aims and wrecked several countries. The United States is responsible for 39% of global military spending. And I'd like to point out the resources at the bottom of this slide. National Priorities Project, which is a project of the Institute for Policy Studies, does a fantastic job of tracking military spending and indicating what else it could be spent on. And obviously, mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis should be very high on that list. And on the other side, the right side, Brown University's Cost of War Project, they have a very deep and interesting website where you can explore these issues further. Next slide. The last general to become president called out our situation clearly in a prophetic speech in 1953. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This banner on the left, Air Show Fuels Climate Crisis, is from one of the many bannering actions that have been taking place in San Diego, where the San Diego chapter of Veterans for Peace, led by my colleague on this project, Gary Butterfield, has formed a coalition with 20 climate and environmental groups, including 350 San Diego. And they have had a meeting with the commander of the nearby Miramar Marine Corps base, and they are pushing hard to get those air shows in San Diego shut down. San Diego, as you probably all know, is one of the most militarized cities in the United States. So this is already quite an achievement for our folks in San Diego. And I think that the Bay Area could certainly step up. I hope so anyway. Okay, next slide. Well, we've now seen a quick overview of the intersection of militarism and climate crisis, which so far has never been addressed by any major U.S. environmental or climate organization. We hope that changes. But in the meantime, what are Veterans for Peace doing about this intersection of twin existential crises? We're doing public education, advocacy, and street protests, including arrestable direct actions in which people have been arrested. On our website, we have a wealth of information, including recordings of our webinars, interviews and podcasts of our members, recommended books, a few of which you can see on the table in the back, and please do take a look. They're not for sale, but you might get some ideas of reading material, and other resources. We have presented to over 140 audiences in this country. They're civic, climate and environmental, faith and educational. Almost one presentation per week for 3 years. And I'm so proud to be presenting here at the Unitarian Universalist Church in San Francisco. In the past year, we have been able to hit the streets and table at community events. Militarism and wars impacts on the global climate have started to be talked and written about more, finally, although the major U.S. environmental and climate groups still are not taking it on. We hope that changes. Next slide. At the UN Conference of Parties, or COPs, in 2021 in Scotland and 2022 in Egypt, we sent a representative from the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project to represent our work. David Collins in 2021 and Cindy Piester in 2022 traveled to the COPs to network, speak at rallies, hand out flyers to national delegates and climate activists, and attend events calling for the reporting of military emissions to the UN. On the left, you see Cindy, who is a national lay leader with the Unitarian Universalists and my colleague on the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. And as you can see on the right, Veterans for Peace members show up with our message at protests and rallies. No more silos. Ending war must be on the climate agenda. Climate and environmental issues must be part of peace work. Next slide. Our biggest in-person actions so far have been at 2 national marches. in DC, supporting our allies in the Poor People's Campaign, and in New York City last month on September 17th, as part of the first ever 100-strong anti-militarism hub in the march to end fossil fuels. We can't end fossil fuels without reducing the size and worldwide engagements of the U.S. military and military-industrial complex. Every war emits millions of metric tons of greenhouse gases, as well as huge amounts of toxic and radioactive material. Rebuilding after war also generates huge emissions. We can see the visible pollution, while invisible emissions will kill later. Next slide. So militarism and the climate crisis seem scary, overwhelming, and yet also abstract. So what can you do? Here are some suggestions on the slide. I'd like to particularly highlight the first one, supporting a current bill in Congress, H.R. 1134, put forward by Representative Barbara Lee, cut $100 billion from the 2024 military budget. And that has not been voted on yet. Of course, there's been a lot of chaos in Congress lately. So there is a push on to actually be able to cut that immense budget, which approaches $1 trillion just for next year. And you see some other suggestions here. I'd also like to highlight the idea of hosting an event on December 3rd that will be during the COP, and which is in an oil-producing country, and is very inaccessible to civil society, to activists. So we're organizing events here to call for the reporting and reducing of military emissions. So also, I'd like to say that it's one thing to say end the silos between the peace movement and environmental and climate work. How do you do that? One great way that various groups have found over the past 3 years is to host our presentation and invite people from these other organizations to co-host and attend. And then you can have your own discussions afterwards. Let's see. So as people who want our children and all future generations to have a livable planet with justice, we have both the right and the duty to do what we can. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Steve Morse. He'll talk about climate justice and this new initiative that he and others have started. So next slide, please. And then after Steve and Vince talk, we'll have time for Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess that works. Hi, thanks, Janet. Hi, great to be here. I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality. I'm not too familiar with what you do, but I'm sure it's intersectional. Janet was just talking about intersectionality between climate and militarism and the reasons for that and the ways that we work on that. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit additional way. Intersectionality is tricky because you can get too scattered and do too many things, right? And there's so many things to do. So you have to focus, and we all work on that, people who are social activists. I'm going to talk about an initiative we're starting with Veterans in Labor in just a couple minutes. I think Vince will talk some about environmental racism, activism that he's working on. So those things are both also things that need to be considered in relation to both climate and militarism. Now, Janet mentioned the showed the slide of it's 150 plus presentations we've given with slideshows and to different kinds of groups. So there are Veterans for Peace chapters, there are other peace groups, there are climate groups. We found that the peace groups and the Veterans for Peace chapters tend to be fairly tuned into climate already. The climate groups not necessarily tuned into militarism and war. So we're trying to, it's moving forward, but there's this single issue problem that occurs where we don't think broadly enough. And some problems with single issue are that your vision gets kind of truncated, and number one, and another thing is that it's harder to form coalitions. It's harder to get a big enough and strong enough movement to really change the world here. We have to, right? That's needed for that reason. Now, if we think about labor and workers, we know that if we're able to shut down fossil fuel production, and we're able to shut down militarism. Now, the militarism is things we're trying to bring up that isn't talked about that much, but just transition is needed for those workers, and it's needed for the fossil fuel workers and for people in the war industries. Now, oh yeah, sure. Is that better? Okay. Okay, so what happens if you don't have just transition? Well, it's you're throwing workers under the bus, number one. So it's not right. Of course, there are many injustices, but the other thing is they'll fight us. I'm in a building trades union, sheet metal workers. I'm a retired member of Sheet Metal Workers Local 104. Put it up there. Okay. I worked a full career in that. And building trades hasn't usually been in the forefront of progressive politics. However, in my union, there actually would stand to gain from the green economy because of energy efficient retrofitting and things like that. But unions aren't necessarily, some unions are more progressive than others, but there is a reluctance among unions to take on this issue, particularly around war and militarism. Now, there's a reluctance, even progressive unions often are intersectional around things like their own interests, their own workers' interests, but things like healthcare and racism, and yet militarism and war don't get included in that somehow. If you remember back to the Vietnam War, there was a lot of single issueism against the Vietnam War, and people didn't kind of encompass racism or bring racism into that equation. So it can work that way too. But at the present time, a lot of militarism tends to be excluded. So we're trying to work on that. Let's look at labor and climate. There is, if you look at the UAW strike now, they've got tentative agreements with Ford and Stellantis as of yesterday, I think. And looks, they've won. They're strong. They've got an honest, militant union finally, just like the Teamsters have finally, and they won their UPS strike. And an interesting thing is that the UAW did not oppose moving to electric vehicles, but they want to make sure that there's just transition, that it's not a race to the bottom. So what happened was 120 or more climate groups and environmental groups signed on to support the UAW strike. Now this is pretty new, and this is pretty damn good. Now, how do we bring militarism into it? So that's because nobody's talking about that yet, at least in the UAW strike. It's a great victory, and it's wonderful. So we have this we have this project that I've started with two former leaders of U.S. labor against the war. Now, this is back there on the table. You should grab one of these. It's got the links to our documents and such. So U.S. labor against the war started in 2003 and had 200 labor groups as members, which I think is not too well known among activists even. That was a big deal. In 2005, the AFL-CIO came out against the Iraq War, which was a big deal because under the AFL-CIO prior to that, like George Meany and Lane Kirkland, they were working with the CIA. They were supporting the Vietnam War all the way down the line. So we, the three of us, have been kind of trying to coordinate this. I'm trying to coordinate it within Veterans for Peace and expand it. We've gotten some unions to sign on, one national union, one national labor group, and we've used those. We've gotten it out to the mailing list, the 5,000 people of their mailing list and 20,000 people of our revolution, Labor for Bernie. So we're getting out. We've got 300 or more. We've got more than 300 individual signatories, but we're trying to get unions and labor groups to sign on, and we want to. It's not going to. Janet showed a slide of HR 1134, which is people over the Pentagon, Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan. It's not going to pass this Congress. So we're looking in the long term. They're going to bring it up next Congress, and we're trying to build it within labor, put militarism on the table. You know, this $1 trillion that's leads to wars. Wars lead to environmental disasters. Militarism itself is an environmental disaster. And all that money could be used. That money is kind of the muscle to support fossil fuel plundering from the rest of the world, as well as their own emissions. So there's so many problems with militarism, and for working people. So we're trying to figure out how to move forward in that. And also within Veterans for Peace, we haven't had much emphasis on labor. So that's something that I want to see happen more within our organization. So I think that's about it. But pick up a flyer over there. Go to the. It tells you how to sign on. So sign on. If you know people, if you're in a union, retired member or active member, or you know people that are, pass it on to them, and because we want to build this.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Oh, say, can you see any bed bugs on me? So I guess this is okay. I'm Vince Dijanich. I live in Oakland, California. I'm a Vietnam vet and an environmental activist. And I want to talk about some of that work as it relates to racism in the Bay Area. I'm also a member of the Bay Area chapter of the Climate Reality Project. And as part of the Racism and Climate Justice Committee, that committee made a decision to get involved in it's a long name, the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Contamination Cleanup Committee, Triple C for short. And there's a lot of organizations in that, and we cover a lot of the Bay Area, a lot of the North Bay. We haven't moved much into the South Bay yet. And out of that, I want to talk about three areas: Hunters Point, West Oakland, and Marin City, which have community organizations that are part of this coalition. And I guess we'll start on the west with the north, and we'll start with Marin City. I don't know if anybody knows much about Marin City except driving by it, coming back to San Francisco from Santa Rosa or points north. But those houses, those Frank Lloyd Wright designed houses, were built during World War II as temporary housing. Believe it or not, there was a shipyard in Sausalito. So those were built as temporary housing. And part of the issue there is they don't have very good drainage for when they get flooded every winter when it rains. And year after year, the Marin County Board of Supervisors puts $0 in their budget to upgrade the sewers of Marin City. So these people have a lot of asthma and mold and all this other problems because everything's wet over there all the time. That was example number one. Part of let me backtrack a bit. Part of what we're doing in the coalition is we're looking at the impacts of sea level rise in the Bay Area on frontline communities. And what we've found, first of all, there's a lot of stuff at the bottom of the bay that has been dumped over the years that's just sitting there. It can be moved around in turbulent waters. Now, what's going to happen as the sea level rises, the bay is going to rise. Things are going to kind of go in reverse through the sewers and come back up the streets. And a lot of those pollutants are going to be in the low-lying areas of the bay. So that's kind of one of the things the coalition is working on. And within that context, Marin City got involved. The Mothers and Fathers Committee of Hunters Point got involved. Now, Hunters Point, as we all know, had a large shipyard for a long time. I don't know how many of you remember the nuclear explosions or when they were doing nuclear testings in the Pacific in the 50s, early 50s. And they had all these naval ships there, which they got kind of messed up. Well, those all got towed back to Hunters Point to get dismantled. And all that radiation from those explosions is still in that metal. There was supposed to be a cleanup. Never really was completely cleaned up. And the Navy's saying this, and the city's saying this. So it's like nobody's really, what they did was they capped it and they built houses on it. The cancer rates in Hunters Point, the asthma rates, all those diseases are much higher than the rest of San Francisco. And I think that's due to the proximity of them living to where that old shipyard was. In addition to, at one time, before there was Hunters Point, I get closer, it was also called Butchertown. There were slaughterhouses, and there was I think at one point there was 4 tanneries. I worked at one of those in the 1970s for a brief period of time. Most of the workers were either Black or Chicano. And it was absolutely the worst, filthiest job I ever had in my entire life. We're working at a tannery. But there's a lot of chemicals used. It goes to the air. As far as I know, none of those were really capped either. Some of them are, one of them I know now is an industrial park. And I don't know what's there. So, and then you contrast that site to Alameda, to the Naval Air Station, which was, believe it or not, done correctly for the most part. And you can see that, and Alameda wasn't nearly as polluted as Hunters Point, but there was some radioactive stuff there. They had a nuclear carrier and a couple other nuclear powered ships that were there. And so there was some radiation, but that was all cleaned up. And it's an industrial park now, and it's fairly clean. And they're putting houses on another one. I could go talk about, I'll leave out the Concord Naval Weapons Station. Well, maybe I'll save something briefly. That was, they're going to build houses on that. I don't think they're going to fix that one correctly too, because it costs too much. It costs way too much. And the motto of this country ought to be show me the money, because that's what it's all about. It's keep your costs down, make your profits high. And what happens to human beings and communities is not really considered. It's about creating wealth, which we've created so much. We have so much surplus in this country. Let me go back to my script. Hunters Point is like that. West Oakland is basically a Black community surrounded by the Port of Oakland and all the traffic that goes through there. There's some metal recycling plants where they melt stuff down without any proper venting of fumes. So that goes into the area. And again, the rates of cancer and asthma and other diseases are much higher. And that's what environmental racism looks like in the Bay Area. There's other examples that you could look out further. The first time I really became aware of environmental racism was one of these channels on TV, the Learning Channel or something. This is how we take old ships apart. And as everybody knows, there's a lot of asbestos in old ships. They haul them and they beach them in India. They have a lot of people working for very little money, no respirators, no protective clothing, just taking these apart. And I mean, that's still going on. And a lot of our recycled stuff, somebody has to go through that before they can really recycle it. And it's usually done by some person making pennies an hour or less, or however many bales you're getting paid piecework. And they wind up handling stuff that is toxic. So that's how it is. The other thing is, I don't know. Most people in here look old enough to have seen who the Abbott and Costello routine, who's on first, what's on second. I don't know, third base. Well, you could kind of put that up when you're dealing with all the government agencies. There is a DTSC, State Department of Toxic Substance Control, and there's a California Coastline Commission, and there's various other corporate entities. DTSC says, well, talking about the AstraZeneca site in Richmond. Well, AstraZeneca was supposed to clean that up. AstraZeneca, no, that's the state. So there's this thing that goes on, and there's this other group called the BCDC, Bay Area Conservation and Development Corporation, which is a quasi-government nonprofit. It should be just the BDC, it's a Bay Area Development Corporation, because there's really no conservation in it at all. Anytime somebody from an environmental organization gets on that commission, they don't last long because they're really hounded. Well, we can't do that much conservation because it gets in the way of development. And again, it's back to the motto, show me the money. I think also, in the bigger picture, this is an existential crisis, this climate thing, for all of us, every human on the planet and many, many species. What we need to fix this, I think, is a mobilization that we've never seen on a planetary scale. The last time this country was mobilized like that was during World War II. And we're going to need more than that. And most of these people are going to suffer. And every year we delay, it narrows the choices that are going to be available to us to remediate the crisis. And at first we thought, Joe Biden would do something, but then everything, as soon as the war in the Ukraine started, all the climate stuff got sidetracked. The Conference of Parties kind of moved into more and more oil companies started showing up at that. And now they're the majority of that, the extraction industries. And it's all about the money in some ways. And there's a lot of even religious ideology that people use to justify that. Well, God put it in the ground for us to take out and use. That's like the real short version of it. But, so I think we need to learn from indigenous folks as well, because they're and follow their leadership in terms of stewardship of the planet. And they're still fighting to hold on to what they have in their treaty rights. The pipeline stuff, from Canada to the U.S. is not over yet. It's still going. It's still going to be a fight. I don't know what else to say other than I still think we have time to fix this. I don't know what'll happen in the rest of my life. I'm in my mid-70s. I don't know how long, how long I'm going to live. I don't think it's going to be fixed by my lifetime. Even if we stop it, it may not be fixed. But one thing is important to notice is that during the early days of COVID, when everything shut down, the air pollution numbers went in the right direction for the first time. So, I mean, it's going to take something like that. We're going to all have to figure out how to live differently. And I think, me included in this, figure out how to take the collective hypodermic needle of fossil fuels out of the veins. And thank you very much.
I know we just dropped a ton of information, some of it very distressing on you. But I want to just say we're so looking forward to everybody's questions.
I have a lengthy question from Art. I understand that there's been an audit of the US DoD budget. Is that true? And if so, is there an effort in the US to push for the audit, and by whom?
There have been 5 audits or attempts at audits of the Pentagon budget over the last couple decades. The Pentagon has failed every audit. They cannot account for the trillions of dollars. I mean, they can account for some of it, but there's always some missing. And to me, this would fall under the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, who do not fulfill their obligation of true oversight. So, again, as with everything else, it's got to be people organizing to push on the members of Congress who are tasked with that budget oversight of the military to demand that, a full accounting be given. And then that full accounting would indicate clearly some, pretty easy cuts that could start being made right away.
Say something.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's a researcher in Boston, Dr. Netta Crawford, that has written a book, and she has some estimates of what the fossil fuel use is, and kind of as window dressing, the Navy took her numbers and put it in their first report, but they just blanks. They didn't do the work. They just stole it.
But at least it got out. Here's a comment, but I'm going to follow it with a question that's written by the same person. Recently, the deceased Senator Feinstein was a big proponent of military air shows like the Blue Angels. So that's a comment. And this same person wants to know if you've presented in public schools, young people get the climate crisis and are being canvassed to join the military. Somebody want to speak on that?
We'll both speak on it.
Yeah, I was working on November 10th of last year. We had a demonstration the day before Armistice Day, and it was led by Youth versus Apocalypse, which is it's not national. It's a Bay Area organization, but it's very, very active. And they at our convention, Anaya Butler from that group, a leader of that group, who's a high school senior now, mentioned that actually they took on militarism for the first time. They were, they're pretty intersectional, but they hadn't taken on militarism. We went to Lockheed's office in the financial district with about 400 people, mostly youth. But she said that seeing how the recruiters targeted, particularly the young men of color in the schools, was a big impetus for them taking on militarism.
I haven't done any presentations at high schools, but I've done a couple at UC Berkeley. and believe it, of all things, I have a friend who teaches creative writing. So I did it to this audience of about 60 students a couple times, of people that wanted a, creative writing class. So it was very interesting. Mostly people of color, very idealistic kids. Some of them had family members who were being pushed towards the military, and I tried to give them a little information about that.
Oh, one more thing. Our current Veterans for Peace chapter here in San Francisco, chapter 69, started as Veteran Speakers Alliance, and it's still called Veteran Speakers Alliance / VFP. And in the 80s, in the mid 80s, when we were making the connection between intervention in Central America and Vietnam, and we wanted to speak to groups, and we had this idea we'd speak to Rotary clubs and such. It ended up being almost all within the schools, but we did a lot of that in the last half of the 80s.
When Abby Martin asked Nancy Pelosi about the Pentagon's role in climate change, Pelosi advised Martin to follow the lead of the Pentagon. What is your assessment of Pelosi's record on militarism?
Okay. Let me.
Go, Jen.
Pelosi loves to support capitalism, including the capitalism of the immense military industrial complex lavishly supported by the U.S. tax-paying public. So first I want to say something about that confrontation by Abby Martin, a very brave journalist, now documentary filmmaker. Her husband, Mike Preisner, is an Iraq War veteran, and I believe he is in Veterans for Peace as well. They're working on a documentary titled Earth's Greatest Enemy, meaning the Pentagon. I do want to correct something that Abby Martin said in her question to Pelosi, because it's kind of spread around. That video went viral, and she did say something that is not correct, because Abby Martin said to Pelosi that the U.S. emits more greenhouse gases than 140 countries combined. That is not correct. But the U.S. military does emit more than 140 countries. So it's right up there in middle-sized countries like Sweden, on its own, emitting that much greenhouse gas, contamination of the global atmosphere. Okay, so getting back to Pelosi, I know it's so hard to call Pelosi's office and ask for her support for H.R. 1134, put forth by her own Bay Area colleague, Barbara Lee. When I was in Code Pink, I organized so many delegations to Pelosi's office, and of course asked to meet with our supposed representative. I lived in San Francisco at the time. We never were able in DC or here in San Francisco to get a meeting with Pelosi. She has not held a town hall meeting that's open to the public since 2006. She is a disgrace. And I really look forward to Nancy Pelosi living her best life in Napa and San Francisco having a real representative who will deal with the issues of military-caused environmental pollution and injustice, racism, and all the other things that you're facing here in San Francisco. And I have to say, it is a pretty sad commentary on the voters of San Francisco that this woman, this very wealthy lady, has been able to have that high position for so long.
Next question. Do the Vets for Peace reach out to active duty and or reserve soldiers and sailors, etc.?
Yes, we have done so. And the former executive director of Veterans for Peace, who left us last year, Garrett Reppenhagen, was one of the rare active duty soldiers while he was a sniper in Iraq to join Veterans for Peace covertly. And I think with the massive deployment of hundreds of thousands now of U.S. troops, both in Eastern Europe and now very dangerously in the Eastern Mediterranean and elsewhere in the Middle East, we're probably going to have to step that up.
This person says, I believe Barbara Lee voted in favor of supplying weapons and bombs to Israel. If that is true, can you please talk about the inconsistency, the irony of that vote? She was the sole vote against the Iraq War. Okay, so yeah, all right.
Yeah, it's been, yeah, I think mostly she's been great, but there's been a little inconsistency. She's I think she supported more weapons to Ukraine and recently. So yeah.
Okay, here's a question. 44.5 trillion to convert to renewable energy assumes no active resistance, i.e. just the material cost. But fossil fuel interests will spend billions or more to prevent their conversion. Estimate of conversion cost given resistance? How would this be funded? That's a pretty good question.
Do you want to take a crack at that?
Hard answer, hard one to answer.
I think that's kind of a wait and see thing to be realistic, but I'm not going to, it's a reallocation of resources, and I think we really need to look seriously at private property in terms of industrial capital. Most of the wealth of the oil companies or other corporations was made on the backs of working people. I'm kind of what you call a social democrat at this point, in terms of politically speaking. And I think all the subsidies that they have need to end. That's a start. They're wildly subsidized, and I think that would change the landscape. And I think their taxes should be raised as well. I mean, end the subsidies and raise taxes on them, because they are wildly profitable, wildly profitable. And it's going to continue to be that way as long as they have those subsidies. Now, cracking that lobby, I think that requires a mass movement, which we don't have yet. And I'm not sure, how we're going to get there. But I think that's what's kind of needed.
It's complicated about, changing the energy structure of the U.S. And one problem, I spoke about labor. One problem in relation to labor is it's environmentally sound to do rooftop solar, not have these distribution grids and all that. However, basically rooftop solar on individual homeowners' houses has all been non-union work and pretty low wage work. So that's not really a good model going forward. So we also have to think about the workers' high road jobs, union jobs, and in this transition, I mean, solar and wind is cheaper, right? It's cheaper now than fossil fuels. So.
Yeah. The first part was just about the 4.5 trillion, which was the figure that was presented. And the question is, was that just for the United States? That's not for the world. That's for the United States. Okay, does that basically just the material cost, the labor and materials to make that conversion? Yes. Okay. So the reality is it would be much more expensive because there would be all this resistance. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, since the quote excuse for militarism, i.e. building weapons, is that how our government gets dollars from weapons sales? Can you give me a peaceful alternative to that dollar resource? That's a good question.
Sure. The U.S. entertainment industry. um, that question gets at how deeply militarized our economy and trade is. And that's outside of the scope of what we have to present today, but it makes me think that we should have a slideshow presentation just on the militarized economy. I don't want to dodge the question, but I also feel like I don't have a quick answer for that other than we must rework and deeply change our economy so that money is not flooding into weapons manufacturers and other corporations in the military industrial complex on the death and destruction of other people, their lands and waters. I mean, what this money buys, so to speak, makes me think of the line in the Bob Dylan song, Masters of War. Is your money that good? And I would say it's not. It's bloody.
I offer a quick comment on that, Janet. The Green Revolution, I think, was the name of the political project that AOC and others were sponsoring. Was like this. The idea is like, let's put all this the Green New Deal. Let's put all this money into a green economy. It's like it's really a thing that would create new jobs and provide a realistic alternative to the military production.
Thank you.
What thoughts do you have on the War Resisters League and also the About Face Veterans Against the War? And I think there's something here about APEC coming. What is your position on that? So that's kind of a triple question here. Somebody squoze in a lot here.
Well, organizations like War Resisters League and About Face are great. I mean, I'm not quite. I'm not
mouth right at it.
Right at it. Okay, I'm not sure exactly the latest on what they're doing or whether they're having internal issues or what. But we all need to work together, and I'm not going to deal with APEC. You want to take that one?
No, but I will. Okay. Well, there are Veterans for Peace doesn't have a position at this point on APEC. The reason being there's some differences about what ought to happen with APEC, or how we ought to. Most of us on the climate group are going to oppose it, and I think Steve and I are going to have a fight with some people in the San Francisco chapter about it as well, or a discussion. It's all about trade and development. It's still show me the money stuff. It's still on that paradigm, and we do need to reverse that. Not only do we need a green New Deal in the U.S., we need one everywhere else. I mean, we need to ultimately demilitarize the planet. What's the other part of that?
APEC coming. What is your position?
Yeah.
Well, I guess you are talking about APEC.
Yeah, APEC. I don't know much about the War Resisters League at this point. I know the About Face organization is mostly exclusively younger veterans. Younger than me, not young, but younger, post 9/11 for the most part. And we have some dialogue with them individually, and sometimes organization to organization. And there's some of us that have a fantasy about merging the two organizations, but we're a ways off from that. And there's a lot of issues involved there, which I'm not going to go into at this time.
Well, I think unless anybody here has a burning question they want to ask and can come up and ask it, I'm done with all the pieces of paper that I've been given.
I'd like to just.
You got a hand there.
Yeah, and I'd like to read a short quote from this to end.
Okay. Art has a question.
I believe the Sunrise Movement is calling for the president to declare a climate emergency. Can you respond to that, and how, if that's a good call, and so what are you doing to support it, and what can we do?
Yeah, of course, the Veterans for Peace Climate Crisis and Militarism Project recognizes that we are in a climate emergency. And if President Biden were to declare that, he would be able to do certain things with his executive orders and his executive authority that he's not doing presently. Having been involved in the climate emergency declaration process in Portland, Oregon, this can all too often turn into an empty rhetorical gesture. So I'm, and in a way, it's along the lines of John Kerry becoming the climate diplomat for the United States. That started out, in 2021, and Vince and who else was in that meeting, Vince?
Vince and I and Garrett. And
Yeah.
Adrian. And
Yeah. So several members had a meeting with two senior staffers for John Kerry, and then nothing further happened. And you may notice that we're not hearing anything in the news about John Kerry anymore, even though he has pointed out in public speeches that the climate crisis is responsible, or is impacted, obviously, by wars. So I'm not very hopeful about the climate emergency declaration route. It's one more demand. I think we've come to the end of our time. I'd just like to put in a plug for I'm sorry, go ahead.
Janet,
okay.
we have someone on Zoom that would like to talk about APEC for a minute. I've told them they can speak for a minute because we do have to end this meeting very soon, but if I'm just going to give her the floor for a minute, if I can figure out how. Just a moment. Unmute. Yeah.
Am I?
Jackie, I've asked you to unmute yourself, so.
I'm unmuted. So I wanted to talk about APEC because there's a lot of organizing going on right now in San Francisco to protest APEC. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, it's going to be this.
One moment, please. We actually are not set up to do this very well, and no one can hear you in the room here. And I'm not sure how to solve the problem. So I am afraid that we won't be able to really do your question. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, Jackie and everybody, I just want to point out that there's a flyer in the back about APEC, and the Unitarians are concerned about all the related, trade, human rights, environmental rights, and other issues at this huge event that's coming to San Francisco soon. So I think there's a lot of support for opposition to the what seems to be the APEC mission. Okay, I'd like to end with a quote by an Indian writer. For those of us in the United States, the discourse on the climate crisis has been dominated, frankly, by many white men and Americans. And I'd like to read just a short quote by Amitav Ghosh, an Indian novelist now writing nonfiction books about the climate crisis and its deeper meanings. And this book is The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And in the conclusion, he writes, and this echoes something that Vince said very strongly earlier, the scale of climate change is such that individual choices will make little difference unless certain collective decisions are taken and acted upon. And we in Veterans for Peace, Climate Crisis, and Militarism are doing our best with our piece of the work. It's only one strand in a vast tapestry of worldwide resistance to what could threaten the very livability of our planet. So I just want to always keep people's focus away from like I'm buying an EV vehicle or, you know, one particular little thing to the larger picture. So thank you so much. Really brilliant questions. And I look forward to talking to some of you off mic later.
Thank you all so much. And I want to invite you all to come back next week. We will have Nan Parks from 350 Bay Area here to speak about the climate crisis again. So it's just follow on from this. And then 2 weeks from now, we have Dr. Oken talking about homelessness and mental health and the co-issues there. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.